months of warning about this. I started preparing at 9:30 last night, so this is going to be an excellent and very well constructed sermon. It's also going to be a bit tough because I'm going to be talking about a very personal topic that I don't really share with most people. I really have to get to know people before I start talking about this kind of stuff. And that topic is project management and software methodologies. I don't like talking about that with most people because it really isn't of interest to most people out there. Has very little bearing on their day-to-day existence, and it's a very niche thing that a very niche set of people I work with basically or deal with have an interest in. But they say you should talk about what you know, and that's why I'm going to talk about it today. Are we all prepared? Yeah? Okay. So, has anyone heard of NIH? Yeah, David has. It's not the Knights Who Say Me. But NIH is short for Not Invented Here. And it's a description of a problem where a solution or an idea often gets discounted because it's not the right person proposing it. So if you're an outsider in a community and you try and suggest something, it often gets shut down for a variety of reasons. And it's mostly because it wasn't invented here, basically. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I work on software and systems. That's a big part of my job. And I actually help develop them. And there are always problems to solve, right? So as well as this being part of my job, I also contribute to something called open source software. Has anyone heard of open source software? Yeah. So these are programs that people develop. So a program is a set of text instructions for a computer that get translated into an actual program that you run. So if you install Windows or macOS on your laptop, you don't actually get to see the instructions behind the computer. All you get to do is execute the effects of them. So the program you run is basically obfuscated from how it was originally intended to be expressed. Does that make sense to everyone? Open source projects, they develop that source code in the open, so anyone can come along and look at the instructions that went into the program. They can identify problems with it or suggest improvements to it and actually contribute changes to the instructions to change the outcome in the way that the program operates later on. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah. So these projects are often developed by a group of people with a common set of interests, which is that program. So but the process of getting changes from other people means that there's some level of gatekeeping involved. So these people have put a lot of time and effort into getting the thing working to the place it is. It often gets to a point where it becomes quite popular, and then all of a sudden you have all these people who you don't know, you have no relationship with. They're just some people on the internet who found your thing, trying to suddenly make changes to it. This means that there has to be some form of gatekeeping process, right? So you got this program working in a particular way, in a particular level. If some random person comes along, it is very unfair for you to have to take it at face value and integrate it, because there are risks associated with making changes to the thing you're working on. There's always the potential in these systems that there's unintended interactions with the other part of the system. So if you look at what's happening on your phone, for example, we're talking about dozens and hundreds of software components working with each other based upon millions and millions of lines of instructions. Like, this is not an exaggeration, and it's possibly underselling it a little bit, but these are incredibly complicated things. And with the level of complexity we're talking about, there's always this potential for interactions which have unintended consequences. So one resource gets used a bit too much and all of a sudden another part of the system fails, and it's really hard to correlate these two behaviours. So people are really taking care to be careful about integrating other changes because they want to minimise these new unintended consequences and behaviours. So there's always a judgment call about the risks involved. You would think that IT is full of people making rational decisions based upon the pros and cons of the options. That is not true. Turns out a lot of people working in this field are actually extremely emotional people. So there's an ongoing joke that the vast majority of people in IT have some form of neurodiverse thing going on. A very typical example of that is problems with executive function. Has everyone heard of executive function? What it means? So executive function deficits are largely a physiological problem and lead to things like attention deficit disorder, or they're related to autism and all this kind of stuff. But one of the interesting ones is if you have an executive function deficit, it can mean that you are less able to regulate your emotions. So you feel things a lot more intensely and you are less able to rationalize or calm yourself down. So you feel things very strongly. There's a lot of people in IT who feel this, but they mask it. So what they do is they come up with excuses for their reaction to backfill how they feel. Does this sound familiar to anyone? It's not limited to IT, it's just a little bit more common in IT than other fields. But this means if you suggest something to someone else who's very invested in something and they have this emotional and visceral reaction, they will come up with many excuses, lots of excuses, all sorts of technical reasons why they can't do the thing you're asking based upon this feeling. And it is honestly the wrong way around. We should try and intellectualize things and let our emotions follow from that. But what often happens is the emotions start first and then we rationalize why we feel something. That's a whole different topic and how it's the wrong way around, and we should be working very hard to try and keep on top of our emotions like that, but that's not what I'm talking about today. So an example of one of these projects is a piece of software called Home Assistant. Has anyone heard of that? Yeah, Ezra has. David has. Has anyone played with any smart home appliances like smart light bulbs or temperature sensors that you can see on your phone or your air conditioner or something like that? Google Home is an example of this kind of platform. There's Alexa, Apple's Home Kit. Alright. Yeah, all those things. The big intention, well, half the intention with them is you should be able to control appliances in your home from your phone over the internet, right? That's a very big part of what they want to do. Home Assistant is an open source version of that. So rather than being built by a big company like Google or Apple, it's a bunch of people out in the world who just decided to get together we're not going to talk about how these things happen, but that's what happened. Home Assistant is now one of the most popular projects in the world because it allows people to control their home and integrate a lot of appliances outside a company's ecosystem, basically. It is now the de facto standard for smart home stuff outside these big companies. And because of that, it now has a lot of implicit authority is held by that project. And what I mean by that is, if Home Assistant says it is a particular way, or the developers of Home Assistant say it should be a particular way, it becomes that way. That becomes the truth for a lot of people because of that implicit trust in their authority. I personally think this is wrong. You can't be right about everything all the time just by virtue of your position or your authority in the world. And there is a label for this. So in argumentation theory, there's something called argumentum ad populum, which is Latin for appeal to the people. It is a fallacious argument which is based on claiming a truth or affirming something is good because many people think it is so. But us as Adventists, we're used to being the remnant. We're very familiar with this idea of what is popular is not right. I don't have to explain that to you people, right? We're very used to the idea that the majority of belief is not necessarily the truth. We believe we're the remnant church, that we've got a lot of cultural identity tied up with this thing where we try and hold on to the truth above all else, including this implicit authority that popular solutions or ideas are reality. Does that everyone agree with that? Yeah. So an example of where this falls apart in Home Assistant is with air conditioners. So everyone has used an air conditioner here, right? If you look at a remote, there's a power button. So you press the button and it turns it on or it turns it off. And then there's a separate set of buttons for changing the mode. And the mode is whether the air conditioner is heating the house or cooling the house, or if you let it automatically try and pick between hot and cold to reach a certain point. Home Assistant thinks that off is a separate mode. So instead of having a separate on-off button, they want you to have a selector between off, cold, hot, and auto. And this seems like a really trivial thing, but it has lots of consequences for people who are trying to integrate into Home Assistant, because in reality, pretty much all the air conditioners have an on-off button and then a separate mode button. So the people who are trying to get their air conditioners working within Home Assistant have to add this extra logic and extra code, and it's annoyingly subtle to pretend that on and off is an extra mode. So this is a really, really trivial example of the kind of thing that's going on. Another example of where Home Assistant gets it wrong with air conditioners is most air conditioners also have controls for changing where the air points in a room, right? So on your remote, you have a button that points the vanes on the air conditioner straight down, or it can swing right. You've all seen that button on the remote? There's another button on the remote that can change where the air points left to right. So there's one that points to the far left, to the slight left, middle, right, and far right. Home Assistant does not believe that the horizontal controls exist. And again, this is such a trivial thing, but it's a quality of life issue for a bunch of people because their equipment has this functionality, and Home Assistant makes this claim that they want to enable people to use their equipment to their full advantage, but it doesn't have this functionality. So there's the same people who get upset about trivial things and try and backfill it. They're also the users. They're like, well, I should be able to change this thing, but I can't change this thing. What's going on? So me, as someone who can change programs, I actually submitted changes to Home Assistant that implemented this. So if you put my code into Home Assistant, it gives you the ability to not only change the vertical vane position, but the horizontal vane position. But there's this gatekeeping process in Home Assistant, right? So their response to my submission was to do absolutely nothing, which is very rewarding as a person who's just doing basically a small fix, throwing it over the fence and wanting to move on. The other frustrating thing for me is I posted this change and a justification for it, and I went through some of their processes where I tried to address the architectural decisions and things like this. But that was 2021, and because I created this change, I get to see people commenting on this change. So about once a month, someone goes, I have an air conditioner from a different manufacturer with this functionality, it would be really handy to integrate it. So every month I get a reminder about Home Assistant has ignored me and not integrated my change, which is actually wildly popular or widely believed to be useful. And if you actually look at what a physical air conditioner can do, it is easily justifiable because that's what's happening. But because the people inside the Home Assistant project don't think it's a problem, it isn't a problem for them, it's not a problem for everyone. Does that make sense?
No.
Yeah. But gatekeeping can work in lots of different ways, right? And I said gatekeeping is necessary because you want to maintain standards and keep a lid on all these unwanted interactions with other complex systems. But this problem of ignoring changes because they're inconvenient or challenge your existing worldview and stuff like that, that term has become so loaded that gatekeeping is now like an insult. If someone accuses you of gatekeeping, I don't think it's specific to the field I'm talking about, but if you're spoken of as being a gatekeeper, then they're not saying a nice thing about you. Has anyone experienced that? Yeah. So, yeah, like I said, there's lots of ways of doing it. Another way that gatekeeping can happen is if you propose and acknowledge that something is fixed for 90% of a problem, but they won't accept it because it's not 100% of a fix. They demand you go the last 10%, or they will ignore you completely. So the problem with this is 90% of an improvement is still better than 0% of an improvement, right? And that last 10% is often procedural stuff, like you have to make sure that there's only a certain number of spaces on a line in a file, which is not something hard for the people in the project to keep an eye on and fill that gap. But for someone outside who doesn't have explicit understanding of these requirements, it's a big challenge to go through and find out how to cross the T's and dot the I's. The same amount of effort that the people inside the fence take to tell me what I'm doing wrong, they could just fix that last 10% and integrate it, and we would all have the benefit of it. But instead, because people don't have the energy or the expertise or the desire or time to do that last 10%, that means the entire community suffers because 90% is there and not taken on board, right? Another one is these unintended consequences do occur, and it's often people who are very familiar with the subject matter who are able to identify them. So a lot of times there's someone who proposes something that looks simple, and then people inside the project, their response is, how do you know about this problem, this obvious problem to me? I can't trust anything you do now, which is very demoralizing. There's no process or desire in that situation for the person inside the project to educate the person and fix it. All they do is shut them down. My favourite problem in projects like this is seeing an idea proposed or a solution proposed or even changes proposed and submitted and being shut down, and then a period of time later, like a year or two later, the project goes, hey guys, I've got this great idea, and it's literally the same thing that was suggested 2 years ago, but because it came from someone inside the project, it's suddenly okay, whereas because it came from someone outside the project, it's not. But it's the same. So why am I going on about this? I would like us to look at Mark 9:38. My Bible study group recently has started reading the book of Mark, so we're doing a chapter a week. But we're doing that based on a sermon I heard. I think Lindy might have been there, but during COVID, Ellie did a sermon about the book of Mark, and he challenged everyone to read the book of Mark from start to finish in one go and see what they get out of it. I got 90% of the way through, but then I had to have lunch and it all went horribly wrong after that. But this one story in the middle of all of it, it's 3 verses, really stuck in my head, and I think about it a lot. So does anyone want to read Mark 9:38?
And John answered, just me up.
Yeah.
And John answered him, saying, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and he followed not us, and we forbade him, because he followed not us.
So this is the disciples going to Jesus and going, we saw another guy casting out demons, so we told him to stop because we don't know who he is. Does this sound similar to what I was just talking about? So what's going on here? So if we go back a few verses, back up to 33, can someone read 33 and 34?
They came to Capernaum, and after going indoors, Jesus asked his disciples, what were you arguing about on the road? But they would not answer him, because on the road they had been arguing among themselves about who was the greatest.
Yeah, perfect. So what's going on here? So I like Mark 9:38 on its own as a little story. It's just 3 verses, but it's kind of fun to unpack it with the context around it. So in 9:38, the disciples are expressing their upset that someone else was doing their job, basically. And if you go back a few verses, you see that they were complaining to each other and arguing with each other about who was doing the better job and who had more right or more responsibility or more right to be first into heaven or to sit at the right hand of God. Let's go back a little bit further. Does someone want to read verses 17 and 18?
And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him. And he foameth and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spoke to thy disciples that they should cast them out, and they could not.
So the context here is this is when Jesus sent the disciples out and empowered them to cast demons out in the community. So someone took advantage of this situation and came to the disciples with someone who had a demon and asked them to cast it out, but they could not. So we're in a situation where the disciples can't do the job that they were asked to do. They were busy arguing about who is better at the job, and then they're shutting down someone in verse 38 who was doing the job but they didn't know.
Yeah.
So the disciples seem more concerned with being first. They are more concerned with keeping themselves insular and their proximity to Jesus. They were relying on their membership for that club to get into heaven and be part of God's kingdom rather than what they were actually supposed to be doing. Now, what were they actually supposed to be doing?
Supposed to be conduits with God's love and power, so that they don't matter. And he could have chosen any 12. So, and they should have realised that. They were already rejected because they weren't aligned to any other teacher.
Yeah.
They failed already, and yet he chose them, knowing their faults. And so they should have recognised that it was not their attributes that had called them onto his team. It was just because he loved them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I think there's another thing as well. Jesus asked them to help the community, right?
Yeah.
He was supposed to go out and make they were supposed to go out and make the community better. And instead they were arguing about who was going to hold Jesus' hand as they walked into heaven. They completely missed the point. There was no concern or empathy for the people. They were doing the job to get the points or the pay at the end of the day. There was no understanding about what the point of that job was. Do we agree? You see what I'm trying to say? So another common problem and frustration I have in like software kind of stuff is that people often confuse adherence to the processes or the choice of tools, like all these secondary effects. They seem more important to people than the actual result of the software, right? So I work on a project called OpenBSD. So OpenBSD, it started in, I had to look this up, it was the project as a thing called OpenBSD started in 1995. But you can trace its history back all the way to the late 70s. Like there's a very long story history there. One of the things OpenBSD did differently to everyone else at that time is they adopted a tool called CVS. CVS is a tool that exists so you can track changes to the source code over time. So because OpenBSD has been using CVS for 30 years, I can go back 30 years and see what the code was like on day one. I can see who made changes to it, and I can see a description from that person about what changes being made. So this is 1995. The standard tool for doing this kind of stuff in 2024 is something called Git. The thing is, Git was invented in 2005. So OpenBSD had been successfully using CVS to solve this problem for 10 years before Git was even started. And in the 20 years since then, Git has taken over from a lot of things. But as the OpenBSD project, Git is a lot more complicated and it's a lot more, and it requires changes to how we coordinate as a project. And we just haven't seen the point of it, right? But at the end of the day, all it does is let you see who made a change when and why, which is the same thing that CVS does. But a lot of people discount OpenBSD as a project in 2024 now because we do not use Git. But they're making a judgment call on the quality of our software based on something that doesn't actually matter. What actually matters is whether the program has a bug in it or is easy to read or does the thing it was supposed to do. the way we got there is less important, right? Like, the program is not the tool that was used to make the code. The process doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't matter how the sausage is made as long as it tastes good, right? Probably talking to the wrong crowd here on that one. But this is the idea that the methodology matters, right? So I work at a university, so I have unfortunately absorbed a bit of this mindset of looking at research and seeing papers go by. There was an interesting one that went past about 10 years ago, which was looking at the software development methodologies versus the outcome of a software project. So this was looking at whether the management processes you have in place have any impact on whether the thing you build actually succeeds. Does that make sense? And they found, so there's a lot of different methodologies. There's really dumb ones where someone sits in an ivory tower and says, you're going to do this on this date, this on this date, this on this date, and it'll all be fine. So that's traditionally called the waterfall model because all these effects kind of cascade down linearly. But the criticism is there's no way to go back and reevaluate whether that's actually the right thing to do at the right time, this kind of thing. That's usually introduced as the very first and also very worst software development methodology. There's other ones like Agile, where you have to stand in a team, like as a group of people, and talk every day about your feelings and what you're going to be working on. That's kind of the gold standard these days. I'm very dismissive. But the outcome of this research was that there is actually no correlation between the methodology you use and the success of your software. So how you make the software, which of these you subscribe to, has no impact on whether it'll work or not. What they did find though, at the end of this, how you get on with your teammates does matter. So how you work together rather than which methodology you use, whether you're able to socialize and talk respectfully and be friends with the people you're trying to work with, has a much, much bigger impact on whether the thing is going to work at the end of the day than which book you read about the methodology. So my takeaway from this is the rules are often less important than the relationships we build along the way, right? And we've only gone back and looked at the first 3 books of Mark, but Mark is full of stories where Jesus gets judged because of how he helps people. Like, the way you read them, the fact that he's helping people is irrelevant to the people who are criticizing him. So even if we look at even like the first story in Mark 3, I might have it here. In a second. So another time Jesus went into the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So again, what was the thing they were missing here? I have lost my notes. It's basically the same thing that the disciples were missing before. In that story, did you feel like there was any concern for the man and his shriveled hand? Like, were they even impressed that he was healed? There's other stories in Mark where the one where a paralyzed man's friends lowered him through the roof of the house Jesus was in, and Jesus said, "Your sins are forgiven." And the Pharisees around were way too obsessed with this idea that how dare he claim to be able to forgive sins. And Jesus' response was, well, is it easier for me to say your sins are forgiven, or is it easier for me to heal this person? And then proceeded to heal the person. And the Pharisees got massively annoyed and went off and tried to plot to kill him. And again, there's a very little concern here for the person who felt they needed to be forgiven and then, as a bonus, was healed, right? And I feel like we are a bit like that. Do you mind if I take a sidestep and talk about Pharisees a little bit? So do we actually know who Pharisees are? Has anyone actually looked into the history of Pharisees and know what they are? Who they are? So there were basically 3 sects or schools of religious thought in Israel around the time of Jesus. There were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, but I'll talk about the Pharisees. The Pharisees were kind of day-to-day people. They were like blue-collar workers, but they had this theology where if we only get the rules right, then all these other things will happen. So they were very concerned with adherence to Moses' law. And they believed that if they could get enough people with enough of the culture adhering to the law, then there would be no excuse for Jesus or the Messiah not to come and deliver them a period of peace. So they were mostly concerned about the sanctity of Israel, the peace of Israel, the Messiah coming to save Israel and kick out the Romans and stuff like that. And they very much thought that a big part of how to achieve this is being pure by following the rules. And they liked rules so much that they not only took the written rules from Moses, but they also took the oral tradition and rules that allegedly Moses said and passed down through the generations, and they codified it. So it was all about the rules for them. But as you can see, like Mark likes to set them up as the foil, well, the author of Mark likes to set them up as a foil and has this very polemic, I think it's a bit exaggerated, the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees, but from a literary point of view, it makes perfect sense to try and throw up the Pharisees as these people who were so obsessed with the rules that they continually ignored the needs of the people around them. And they were so obsessed with the rules that they thought breaking the rules was the sin, rather than this using the rules as a means not to help the people around them. And Jesus calls them out on it constantly. You read these stories in Mark 2 and Mark 3, and I'm sure there's going to be more coming up. They go, why are you breaking the rules? And he goes, what is the point of the rule? Every one of these questions the Pharisees ask, Jesus replies with another question going, what's the point of the rule here if it stops you helping the person? And that's the question I wanted to ask today and pose to you. So what are the lessons here for us? I am pretty confident in saying that as a group of people, we have become, or we are very concerned with the process and rules more than the outcomes. Like, an exaggerated thing is we won't go to parties in case there's food there that we can't eat, and it's better to keep away from that and keep ourselves clean than it is to make that relationship with people. The Pharisees collected these rules and traditions and they mistook them for virtue. There's another story in Mark where Jesus was hanging out with tax collectors and having a party with them, and the Pharisees go, how can you associate with these people? They break the rules constantly. And his answer was, well, but these people need my help more than you. They have more of a problem that needs to be solved than other people in the community, so it's much better for me to spend my time here trying to help them than help people who are much closer to where they should be. So I would argue that just like the software methodologies paper, connecting with people leads to better outcomes. You are going to have a much better community, a much better, happier experience and community and life if you can connect with the people around you. If there is a rule that doesn't actually matter, that's getting in the way of you forming that relationship, then the rule is the problem. Jesus made it very clear that the fundamental law that we have to adhere to is love your neighbor as yourself, love your God. Everything after that is just explanation of that in various situations, but they are proverbs, not laws that you will suffer forever for breaking. The challenge is we have to get to know God well enough that we know when these situations arrive and what the best answer is in these different situations. But putting yourself out there and talking to people and building those relationships is always going to be the right thing to do. And the more people we can involve in this process, so we can solve the problems as people better together. And the better we get to know each other and know what our strengths and weaknesses are, the better able we are to respond to situations and the people around us as best we can. If you're, so our third hymn is number 306.